Hi, I'm Samantha Neely, and I'm going to be talking about two different ATP pathways for this CAP1 assignment. The first ATP pathway is glucose catabolism, which is the breakdown of glucose. There are two different types of glycolysis that are involved with this process. One is anaerobic glycolysis, which is without oxygen, and the other is aerobic glycolysis, which is with oxygen. The first part of this diagram shows anaerobic glycolysis occurring, which is a very fast process to produce ATP, but it's limited in how long it can sustain that quickness. The glucose molecule is being split or broken up through a series of reactions. There, as the textbook states, there are two ATP needed to prime the pump to start those reactions. So through a series of reactions that involve hexokinase, phosphatase, and phosphofructokinase, the glucose molecule is broken up. Along the way, 4 ATP are transferred. Hydrogen molecules come off and bind to the NAD that's already in the cell, creating NADH, and the result are 2 pyruvate molecules. Now, the 4 ATP that was produced only ends up being a net gain of 2 ATP since there was 2 ATP needed to start the reaction. At this point, the 2 pyruvate have a choice. They can stop where it is and convert to lactate and hopefully restart the system to quickly produce 2 more ATP, which isn't a whole lot, but it's quick. Or it can choose the different pathway and lose carbon dioxide, convert itself to 2-acetyl-CoA, and go through the citric acid cycle, which is also known as the Krebs cycle. Oxygen, the presence of oxygen, is really the determining factor on which pathway it takes. Now in this example, I'm going to assume that there's an abundance of oxygen and we can go through the citric acid cycle for the purpose of explaining and also for the purpose of getting the most amount of energy out of this glucose molecule right here. So, where we're at right now, pyruvate chose to convert itself to 2-acetyl-CoA. On the way, hydrogens came off and they converted into 2-NADH. The 2-acetyl-CoA that is now the result are 2 2-carbon chains, which the citric acid cycle accepts readily. The citric acid cycle will take 1 acetyl-CoA at a time, and with each turn of the cycle, there are 3 NADH produced, 1 FADH, and 1 GTP, which is guanosine triphosphate, which is very easily converted back into ATP through substrate level phospholipation. Since there are 2 acetyl-CoA, the cycle will go through 2 times, which produce 6 NADH, 2 FADH, and 2 GTP. Now, through oxidative phosphorylation via the respiratory chain or the electron transport chain, there are different amounts of ATP that are produced, whether we're dealing with NADH or FADH. Now, NADH and FADH produce ATP because they act kind of as carrier trucks, if you will, for the electrons. And as those electrons are going down the chain, energy is created and they are eventually, the hydrogens are dumped onto the oxygen, which is a big part of the aerobic glycolysis, and water is produced as a byproduct instead of the lactate that creates an acidic environment for the muscle. Water is a lot better for muscle contraction, obviously, and as we can see here, 2.5 ATP for every NADH and 1.5 ATP for every FADH. The calculations over here give us a grand total of 32 ATP yielded from glucose catabolism. The second ATP pathway is fat catabolism. We are dealing with palmitate, which is a 16-carbon free fatty acid chain. 1 molecule of fat is comprised of 1 glycerol and 3 free fatty acids. Through a process called lipolysis, the glycerol is separated from the free fatty acids so that they can each individually be broken down for energy. Glycerol is accepted into the glycolysis process and eventually yields 19 ATP towards this fat catabolism. As for the free fatty acids, each one goes through a process called beta oxidation. Each free fatty acid is 16 carbons long, and what beta oxidation does is it cuts the 16 carbon chain into 8 2-carbon pieces. The 2-carbon pieces can be converted into acetyl-CoA, which is something familiar because that was present in our last process of glycolysis. So the 2-carbon pieces transfer into acetyl-CoA, and they are able to go through the citric acid cycle. The citric acid cycle will turn 8 times because there's 8 2-carbon pieces. And that leads us to the calculations on how much ATP is really being produced. Although it can get kind of nitty-gritty on calculating the little individual things, the main point that I want to make is that we go through beta oxidation 7 times with the 16 carbon chain because we are cutting that chain in 7 different places. We go through the citric acid cycle 8 times because the result of the chopping is 8 2-carbon pieces that eventually go into acetyl-CoA. Once the citric acid cycle is complete, then those NADH and FADH pieces go into the oxidative phosphorylation via the respiratory chain, the electron transport chain again. Once again, the different values of ATP for NADH and FADH are as follows, and we come out with a net total of 106 ATP, which is a lot more than 32 ATP in a glucose breakdown. The 106 ATP, though, is only for one free fatty acid, and we have to remember that a fat molecule contains 3 free fatty acids. So if we multiply that number by 3, we get 318 ATP, which is a substantial number of ATP. But once again, that's not the only thing because we have to remember that a fat molecule also has a glycerol, and that glycerol went through glycolysis and yielded 19 more ATP for a grand total of 337 ATP yielded from fat catabolism. When considering the 2 different types of ATP pathways that I just discussed, and we add in the question of what does that mean for intensity and duration of exercise, I like to think of it as the intensity dictates the duration and the energy metabolism used. So in any sort of exercise or daily function, the body never really just uses one energy metabolism system, but there definitely is a predominant system being used, and they all work together in order to create that energy. With glucose catabolism, considering the anaerobic glycolysis without the oxygen, it's the fastest way to produce energy, but it doesn't produce a lot of it. If we remember correctly, there's only 2 ATP produced from that process. When I was talking about the pyruvate choosing the 2 different pathways, and it would choose the lactate pathway just so that it could produce more ATP quickly, I mentioned that there was a limit onto how fast and how long it can keep that up. The reason for that limit is because the lactate buildup creates an acidic environment for the muscle, and the muscle does not like to contract in that environment. Eventually, the lactate buildup slows down the process, and the body is not able to keep up with the demand of energy that it needs. Anaerobic glycolysis is ideal for short, high-intensity exercises such as 100-meter sprints or like quick power moves where you're moving for a max of 15-20 seconds, exerting your full power and energy. Aerobic glycolysis is a little bit slower, but it yields 8 times more than the anaerobic glycolysis that we just talked about. This is ideal for longer sprints, maybe a 400-meter race or any sort of exercise where the intensity is still high and the duration is pretty low. We have to remember too that the byproduct of this type of glycolysis is water, which allows us to make ATP steadily for a couple hours because there is not lactate present and we are not creating an acidic environment for the muscle. We have to remember that aerobic glycolysis is only possible if oxygen is present. And another thing that needs to be present, obviously, for glucose catabolism is glucose. So if the body is depleted in glucose, then this process cannot occur, or at least occur efficiently. Then we have fat catabolism. The body has almost an unlimited supply of fat, and as we saw, the amount of ATP yielded from one fat molecule is really, really large. This system is super slow though, and it tends to be less efficient than the carbohydrate breakdown because it needs a lot of oxygen. This is a system that's ideal for long distance running or any sort of exercise where the intensity is low and the duration is longer. A few applications that we can use from these two pathways and apply to the real world are, first of all, considering the importance of replenishing glycogen reserves in the muscles and your liver. So after an intense exercise where you're using high intensity, low duration, and really depleting your body of those glycogen stores and breaking down glycogen as your source of energy, it's super important to replenish those glycogen stores so that your body can use that system again the next time you need it. Secondly, understanding muscular fatigue. I touched on it a little bit. As the lactate builds up, your muscle becomes operating in an environment where it doesn't want to be operating in. So understanding muscular fatigue and why it happens is a huge part of this. And lastly, considering the question, why can't we use fat catabolism all the time? It's truly a shocking number of the amount of ATP that's created from fat. But the real answer to that question is as much as people would love to just burn fat all day, we can't use fat catabolism all the time. This is because it is slower and less efficient than the other processes to create energy. Our body likes to turn to the fast methods of creating energy first for either those emergency situations or just those workouts where you need energy and you need it fast. Fat catabolism just can't provide that fast ATP energy that's needed for those workouts. If we want to activate that fat catabolism, something that we can think about is what I mentioned about the intensity and duration of an exercise. So if we do want to burn that fat, we want to do exercises that are maybe long distance jogging where the intensity is low, but you're able to go for a long period of time, like 30 to 60 minutes. Doing short sprints or power jumps are not going to be activating that fat catabolism system. It's going to be activating the glucose breakdown instead, and it's not going to be targeting that system that we want to target.